So you want to own a corn farm, buy some land, plant a few hundred acres, sell the harvest every fall, watch the checks roll in. Maybe you've driven past a cornfield stretching all the way to the horizon and thought, there's a fortune sitting right there. There isn't. On the average acre of corn planted in this country right now, the harvest sells for less than it costs to grow. And by the time we're done here, you're going to understand exactly why a farmer keeps planting a crop that loses money, who's actually covering the difference, and why the government has been doing this on purpose for almost 100 years. If you appreciate this type of content, gently tap that like button. Here we go. Let's start with what it actually costs to put 1 acre of corn in the ground. Seed, around $112. Fertilizer, close to $165. Chemicals to control weeds and pests, another $49. Fuel, equipment payments, land costs, stack all of it together, and the total lands right around $917 to plant a single acre. Not the whole farm, 1 acre. A typical operation isn't planting 1 acre, it's planting hundreds or thousands of them. So before a single seed even sprouts, there's already a massive number sitting in the ground. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable, and this is the number that surprises almost everyone who hasn't looked at farm economics before. This season, the average corn yield is landing around 183 bushels an acre. Divide that $917 cost by 183 bushels, and a farmer needs to sell their corn for just over $5 a bushel to break even. The actual price farmers are getting right now is $4.40 a bushel. Do that math, and the average acre of corn is running a loss of roughly $110. On a 1,000-acre farm, a completely normal size in the Midwest, that's a loss of more than $110,000 in a single season. But that average number hides something important. Not every corn farm loses the same amount because size changes the math. Farms with the lowest production costs are growing corn for about $1.19 a bushel. Farms with the highest costs are paying closer to $3.67 a bushel for the exact same crop. That's a gap of almost $2.50 on paper for growing the same thing. Researchers who study this call it an L-shaped cost curve. Costs drop fast as a farm grows toward around 750 acres, then mostly flatten out after that. And here's the twist. More than half of all corn acreage in this country still sits on farms smaller than that 750-acre threshold, which means most corn farms in America haven't actually reached the size where the economics start working in their favor. Imagine any other business where the product costs more to make than you're allowed to sell it for, and you keep making more of it anyway. That's corn farming right now for a majority of the farms doing it. But losing money on paper is not the same as losing the farm. Picture 2 farms side by side. Farm A runs 300 acres, still below that efficiency threshold. Farm B runs 3,000 acres, well past it. Both are planting the exact same seed, in the exact same county, in the exact same season. Farm A, sitting on the high end of that cost range, is spending something like $3.67 to grow a single bushel of corn. Farm B, spreading its equipment, its labor, and its fixed costs across 10 times the land, is growing that same bushel for closer to $1.19. At a market price of $4.40 a bushel, Farm B is sitting on real profit per bushel. Farm A is deep underwater on every single one. Same crop, same weather, same year. 2 completely different businesses. That gap is a big part of why American farms have been consolidating into fewer, much bigger operations for close to a century. It's not that small farmers are worse at farming, it's that the cost curve itself punishes them for staying small. So, if the farm is bleeding money every year, where does the difference actually come from? This isn't one check, it's a layered system, and the pieces don't all work the same way. The steadiest piece is crop insurance. Farmers pay a premium for it, but the government covers a large chunk of that premium on their behalf. On average, around 62% of it. This year alone, the government is expected to put more than $12 billion into crop insurance premiums nationwide. Add up everything paid out to farmers in claims against what they paid in, and farmers are projected to net around $9.6 billion beyond what they put in. Call it the floor that never turns off. Here's how that insurance actually works in practice, because it isn't a flat handout. Before planting, a farmer picks a coverage level, commonly somewhere around 80 to 85% of their expected revenue, and pays a premium based on that choice. If the harvest comes in fine, nothing happens. The premium is just a cost of doing business, same as any insurance policy sitting unused in a filing cabinet. But if a drought or a flood pushes the farmer's actual revenue below that guaranteed level, the insurance pays out the difference. The farmer still absorbs a real loss up to their deductible before a single dollar of insurance money shows up. It's protection against catastrophe, not a guarantee of profit. But to really see what that floor is for, you have to look at a year when the ground actually gave out. In a recent severe drought, the worst the Corn Belt had seen in over 2 decades, corn farmers alone collected $11.7 billion in insurance payouts in a single season. More than 2/3 of every dollar the entire program paid out that year. Illinois farmers alone received $3.4 billion. Iowa got $2 billion. That's not the system quietly sitting in the background. That's the system being the only thing standing between a farmer and total ruin after a summer that scorched the crop in the ground. This year is calm by comparison, which is exactly why the payments feel small. The size of the check is a direct reflection of how bad the weather actually was. On top of insurance, there's a second piece, a price support payment that kicks in when the market price drops below a government set target. Right now, sitting at $4.42 a bushel. Because the actual price this cycle, $4.40, is sitting almost exactly at that target, this payment is expected to be tiny this year, a few dollars an acre if it triggers at all. When prices crashed harder in a recent season, the government added a one-time emergency payment worth more than $44 an acre for corn, just to help farmers bridge the gap. The system flexes with the weather and the market. When things are calm, it barely shows up. When things go wrong, a much bigger check follows. There's an ongoing debate about who actually benefits most from all of this. Supporters of the program point out that there's no income cap on crop insurance subsidies at all, unlike most other farm programs. And they argue that's exactly what keeps the food supply stable when a bad year hits. Critics point to a different number. Analysis of the program has found the largest 10% of farms collect more than half of all crop insurance subsidies nationwide. Remember Farm B from a minute ago? The 3,000-acre operation already sitting on the efficient end of the cost curve? It's collecting a proportionally larger share of the same safety net that Farm A, the smaller operation, actually losing money, is also paying into. Whether that's the system working as designed, or the system quietly favoring the operations that need it least, depends entirely on who you ask. Why would the government build a system like this in the first place? You have to go back to 1933, and it is a stranger story than most people realize. Farm income had collapsed by more than half since 1929. Prices were the worst they'd been since the 1890s. The goal was something economists called parity, the idea that a bushel of corn should buy a farmer roughly the same amount of goods it could back in the early 1910s, before the war-driven boom and bust wrecked farm income. To get there fast, the government did something almost nobody expects. It paid farmers to destroy crops that were already planted and animals that were already alive. Roughly 10.4 million acres of cotton got plowed back into the ground. And in one of the most controversial moves of the entire New Deal, the government paid farmers to slaughter about 6.4 million young pigs and pregnant sows at a cost of around $31 million, specifically to shrink the supply of hogs, which eat corn, and push prices back up for everyone still farming. The meat was distributed through federal relief efforts, rather than wasted outright. But the optics, destroying food while people across the country were going hungry, were brutal. And the program was controversial from the day it started. It worked, in narrow terms. Farm income rose more than 50% between 1932 and 1935. But the Supreme Court struck the whole thing down in 1936, ruling the way it was funded was unconstitutional. Congress rebuilt it almost immediately immediately in a different legal form. And in 1938, folded in something new, the first version of the federal crop insurance you just heard about. That 1938 law is the direct ancestor of the checks still going out to corn farmers today. Corn isn't propped up because it's special. It's propped up because 90 years ago, the government decided food production was too important to leave completely exposed to the weather and the market, and it never fully walked that decision back.
Which raises the real question. Where does all that heavily supported corn actually go? Because almost none of it ends up on your plate looking anything like corn. About a third of every bushel goes straight into animal feed. Cattle, hogs, poultry. Another third gets turned into ethanol and blended directly into the gasoline in your car. That single use case, ethanol, didn't really exist at scale until federal blending mandates pushed refiners to mix it into the fuel supply. And it's now one of the biggest single destinations for American corn, competing directly with feed and food uses for the exact same bushels. Roughly 14% gets shipped overseas, and only around 8%, less than 1 bushel in every 10, actually becomes something like corn syrup, cornstarch, or corn oil that ends up in packaged food on a shelf. Think about that for a second. The crop that's losing the average farmer roughly $110 an acre is also the crop quietly setting the price floor for a huge share of what's stocked in a typical grocery store, from the soda aisle to the meat counter to the gas pump out front. It's easy to walk past a cornfield and see nothing but a plant. What's actually growing out there is closer to raw material for at least 4 separate industries at once, each one buying at a price that's been shaped indirectly by everything we've just walked through. That small 8% slice matters more than its size suggests, because it's the piece that touches the food you eat most often. High fructose corn syrup, made from that cheap, supported corn, is inexpensive to produce, which is part of why it ended up in so many processed foods and sodas in the first place. And on the feed side, cheap corn means cheap feed, which means cheaper meat and dairy at the store than you'd otherwise expect. This is part of why a lot of economists point to corn subsidies as one of the reasons a fast food burger can end up cheaper than a fresh salad. Meat and processed ingredients are riding on decades of supported corn. Fresh produce mostly isn't. So back to that opening question. How does a farmer keep planting a crop that loses money? On its own, they can't, and most of them never really have to find out because they were never actually farming alone. The harvest you see in the field is only half the business. The other half is a 90-year-old safety net that gets bigger the worse things get, built by a government that decided, back when people were destroying food to save the farm economy, that this crop was too important to let the weather decide its fate. None of this shows up when you're standing in a field looking at rows of corn stretching to the horizon. It looks like agriculture. What it actually is, underneath the surface, is closer to a heavily managed financial product with a plant growing on top of it, priced and backstopped by decisions made in Washington nearly a century before anyone planted this particular season's seed. That's the actual anatomy of a corn farm. If you want more of the systems hiding behind everyday things like this, subscribing is the easiest way to catch the next one.